Hi, I'm Tim of the 1916 Company, and thanks for logging on. It's always fun to take an online friendship offline. Today, for the first time in person, I'm meeting a good friend from my horology WhatsApp group. Christian, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
This is really cool because, again, attaching faces to the WhatsApp handles is kind of the meaning of community in the watch space. And you have been a participant since, well, I guess almost forever. Like a lot of stories, this one starts with a Swatch. How'd you get into watches? Tell me this tale.
Exactly. So when I was younger, always fascinated by watches. I liked fashion, I liked architecture and engineering. I was also a big fan of antiques at the time. And although, of course, that's not an antiques looking watch, I liked bright colors, and as a child, I was fortunate enough for that to be my first real watch.
Yeah, I mean, the Swatch Sound Chronograph, the SLC 102, it even says 1992 on the dial. Kind of, I guess, a shadow of the future with the colors right here.
Yes, certainly. I've always been a fan of bright colors, and as you can see there with the Alain Silberstein, certainly echoed that watch later on in life.
Now, there was a big gulf between, I guess, your earliest horological experience and the time you became, I would say, a watch enthusiast in earnest. Now, I think there was a Seikos Kinetic somewhere.
There was, certainly. After that watch, it was a Seikos Kinetic, I think, till my late teens, really, yeah.
Now, there was a little bit of a watershed period in your career as a collector and also really your life. And I want you to tell that tale and the watch that sort of acts as the bridge to your life as a collector in earnest. Just take us back to that.
Yeah, sure. Well, when I was 19 years old, unfortunately, I was admitted to hospital, and I always remember a very British question from a surgeon there. He said, right, we can either do this surgery or you can die. And I said, well, that doesn't really sound like an option. He said, well, technically it's two choices. So I went for the first one, which is why I'm sat here now. And I always remember the surgeon said, great choice. I would have made the same one. And he was wearing that very Rado watch. And for my 21st birthday, I was fortunate enough to have been given that. And it's a great treasure of mine, one of the few quartz watches I still have. Will never get rid of it. And it still gets quite a lot of wrist time.
Now, it's a fascinating piece because this is a diastar. This is actually a ceramic diastar. I can see nary a mark on here. I don't know how you wore it, if you wore it carefully or in earnest, but this is sort of living up to Rado's reputation for indestructible finishes.
That has certainly not been worn carefully. That has been scraped against brick walls. That has been slammed on the floor. It is pretty indestructible, quite frankly.
Now, it's interesting to me because you do have some watches here that reflect influences in your lives. People you respected, the doctor who made quite an impression at a pivotal period in your young life. And I'm just kind of curious, like, when did you decide that, okay, now is the time to buy in earnest? And how did you figure out what that would be? Was it a person? Was it a place? Was it something you saw in passing? How did you choose that first mechanical watch?
Great question. Well, I think watches obviously measure the passage of time, but by the same token for me, they also represent static moments in time. Certain moments in my life, certain achievements, certain goals, certain events. I think when I first started really collecting, it would have been with the Baume Mercier then. That was the first automatic watch, non-quartz watch. It was the first watch that I purchased myself, and it was after my first year working, essentially. The first thing I wanted to do was get myself a proper watch, as I thought at the time.
Now, at this point, you were still working in the UK, correct?
Yes, yeah.
You hadn't come to the United States yet. What were your influences? Like, what was it that drove you to this? Did you just fall in love with it in a case? Did someone suggest it? Was it a bug that had been planted years earlier?
So in terms of watches in general, always been a fan. In terms of that specific model, it was price, quite frankly. I was looking in the shop window, looking for a watch that was under £1,000. There was a sale on. I remember that watch at the time, I think it was £625. There's some features, a nice clean looking dial. I think it's a beautiful looking watch. And for me, as soon as I saw it, that's the one I'm going for.
Yeah, Classima Executive steel case, 42 millimeters, a 7750. This was really like a point of entry into no joke real watchmaking.
Exactly.
And how long was this your daily driver? Like, how long was this your main watch?
Oh, many years. Probably 5 or 6 years. That would be the watch that I would wear the most, yeah.
So what led you to the next phase of your collecting life in earnest? earnest? Was it your move to the United States, changing your career status, life milestone? What brought you to the collection that we see today?
So all of the above. There was certainly a lot of seeds I'd had sown in terms of watches that I wanted while I was still in London, but it wasn't really until I moved to the US that I started making enough money to be able to actually buy those watches. So a classic example of that is my first job in London. I was assigned a mentor, and he was wearing this very watch, although actually it had the Roman numeral dial, and I must admit, a good example of wait for the watch you really want and don't just jump in because you see something that's slightly cheaper. I still wish I'd gone for the Roman dial on that model.
So now Ulysse Nardin Maxi Marine, a really cool watch, a little bit offbeat. Did his personality match the watch?
Certainly did, and that really was the start of my love for UN overall. I was very clear at the time that I wanted to buy a brand that was perhaps a little bit off the beaten path. Where I worked, a lot of people had Breitlings, and I was just like, I want something that's a little bit less known, a little bit more unusual.
Now, I actually have to say, you have proved me wrong already here, because I've always said that if you don't buy the watch you really want, you're going to wind up buying it down the road and having two watches. You have yet to actually buy the Roman numeral version of this watch.
Correct. I think that's partly because it's a lesson for me. Every time I wear that, I still love the watch, but it reminds me that wait for what you really do want, and don't just compromise.
Now that's really good gouge, as we used to say in the Navy, for watch collectors. In general, I found that every time I didn't buy the watch I wanted, I wound up with the two watches, the one I didn't want and the one I ultimately did.
That happened to me with the Panerai as well. I wanted it with the cutout dial, so you see the indices poking through. I ended up going for the lume. A year later, I ended up buying another one with the cutout dial. I still use both of them, but it's another good example of wait for what you really want.
So you see, it's sort of inescapable. Now, along the way, you picked up some pieces that I would describe as fascinating and eclectic, and I think it was it at the point you moved to the United States that you joined the Patek fraternity?
Yes, that was my first watch actually when I moved to the US. Always dreamed of owning a Patek. Wasn't ever sure if it would be possible, but once I got to the point that it was possible, for me it was an easy choice. I wanted a Calatrava, but I wanted something that was a little bit more different rather than just the very basic model. Didn't want a Nautilus at that time. Back then, Nautiluses weren't as popular as they are now, and I do have a Nautilus now, I love them. That is still my favorite Patek that I own though.
Yeah, 5134, a travel time watch, sort of like the legacy of the old 2597. But you had something specific in mind looking for a dual time.
Yes, moved to New York and I wanted to always know what the time was in London as well, where my family was based. So that was always the goal. That was the priority actually, rather than necessarily a Patek. But I'd always wanted a Patek as well, so it kind of fit together very nicely.
And it really is sort of an interesting commentary on just how quickly trends develop in the watch space, that, for a relatively young man who's lived in the United States for a decade, just a decade ago, a Nautilus wasn't the obvious choice or even on the radar.
And I think that's a watch that I rarely see that. I don't see it online in shops. I've never really seen it on anyone else's wrist. So for me, it's just fantastic because I don't think I've ever actually seen another one of those since buying it.
And it is funny because I can remember back in 2014 when I was getting started in the watch industry, there were forum discussions about whether a Nautilus is even really like a full-fledged Patek Philippe. If you're not going with a complication or a Calatrava or a pocket watch. And I remember back at Watch You Want, you used to buy the Nautilus for $16,000 and sell it for $19,000. We thought we were doing great.
I'll take as many as you'll sell me at $16,000, that's for sure.
No, it's refreshing to see someone who actually went in for a dress complication early in his collecting career.
Still one of my favorite watches.
And a fun piece, and a beautiful piece. And I guess the interesting thing about your collection is after this watch, you start to demonstrate a little bit more community influence on your choices, but we're not quite there yet. Yeah. Take me through these two pieces, because you've got the Audemars Piguet, a 5594, it's a date-8 Moonphase mid-size Royal Oak, and then Chrono Bauhaus from Alain.
Two very different watches.
Very different and different from anything else on the table.
So the Patek was also my first gold watch, and I've always been a fan of bimetal. I know that's quite a divisive topic. A lot of people hate them, but I'm a big fan. I think when it's done well, it looks fantastic, and that's a good example of that. I must admit, for me, that is the sort of watch that you wear a double-breasted pinstripe suit with a cigar, and it's a very much a sort of old Wall Street type watch. And it came up at a very, very attractive price. This is long before we started to see watch prices skyrocket. And it's, again, that's still one of my favorite watches to this day. It's worn, it's clearly been over-polished, but that's another piece that I'll never sell. And I love the waffle dial on that, I really do. I get lost in that. And a Moonphase as well, which was fantastic, something that I'd never had before.
Without a doubt, I mean, it's a very appealing watch. You've got a classic dial with just enough patina, a lovely hobnail. There's a nice balance to the dial. It's not strictly an owl. You know, the owl, of course, just the day and the date. It's got the moon, but then it's also got the monoblock case construction that's now a dead deal at Audemars Piguet, so it's kind of a window into the way they were and the integrity of the products from that period. It's made like 1985 to 2006. The watch really feels like a throwback qualitatively.
Yeah, exactly. And you don't see it very often as well. And that's something that I do like with watches that you don't necessarily see that much. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't the classics that are very popular that I like as well. There's certainly plenty of those. But anything that's slightly off the beaten path, I really like. And as for the Alain Silberstein...
Yeah, speaking of off the beaten path...
Yes, so bright colors, huge fan. I love Alain Silberstein. He has made so many beautiful, beautiful watches. But again, a brand that doesn't get that much recognition. But as soon as you see that, you know exactly who made that. There's no doubt about that whatsoever.
Yeah, the word auteur really describes a person like that. When you see primary colors, when you see primary shapes, when you see a watch whose first and only goal seems to be make you smile, you know you're dealing with it.
Exactly. And look, this is supposed to be fun, right? And that is a very fun watch.
And you made it more so. Please explain this strap, because it looks like it could have been factory fitment. It's not quite.
No. So the original strap was the same color pattern. So one piece yellow, one piece blue with the red clasp. But it was getting very, very worn. So I wanted to keep with that same style. Aaron Bespoke, based out of Montreal, makes some fantastic watch straps. It can pretty much make you anything you'd like, and I believe that's out of beaver skin, that one, so a little bit of an unusual material, but I think the effect is fantastic, and I really like the finish of that, and I wanted to keep that same primary colors, big blocks. I didn't want to try and dull it down at all.
Oh, the watch is beautifully patinaed, I have to say. So this is the real deal, both a pioneering independent, and I guess you could call this new vintage. This is right on the cusp of it.
I don't actually know what year that watch is now I think about it, but the other thing I like about it is I quite like thick watches. You know, there's a big push for thin watches at the moment, but I quite like thick watches, and I like a bit of weight on my wrist. I like to be able to feel the watch. Not that that's particularly heavy, but there's a thickness to it. It's fairly substantial.
Without a doubt, you did mention when we were looking at pieces earlier that you liked the Patek 5905. I'm like, well, you know, the 5960 is similar but smaller. You're like, no, I like the more substantial watch.
Yeah. Now, I have plenty of very small watches as well. I'm not it has to be big, it has to be heavy, but I don't mind that. And a lot of people shy away from that, but that's fine by me. And I don't have particularly big wrists, but as long as it doesn't look too ridiculous, a little bit of heft I think is nice. And it's really about feeling a watch on your wrist. I wear a watch constantly. I sleep with a watch on. If I don't have a watch on, I essentially feel naked. So I like to know it's there.
Now, I can see from two of these watches that you really do wear them, and you wear the good stuff. So speaking of watches that have heft, speaking of watches that get worn, and then I guess a window into your definition of a Grail watch, because you told me this was it. So what do you see as the definition of a Grail? Is it a high reach, or is it an impossibility?
Both, and it depends, I suppose, on how you view things. When I first saw the UN Freak, and that was after actually looking for this watch here, went on the website, saw the Freak, and I fell in love. Amazing design, obviously the history behind the watch, it was groundbreaking, use of silicon. Ludwig did a fantastic job of designing that. And when I first saw it was the white gold one specifically, that was always my dream. Now at the time, I thought it was an impossibility, but it was still always on my radar that maybe one day I'll be able to get it. And when I did, it was a huge moment for me. It was really how shall I put this? It was an acknowledgement of all the hard work I'd done in my life up to that point to get to the point that I could purchase that watch. It is still my favorite watch anywhere in the world, without a doubt. And yes, you have another one very similar, but in yellow gold. That was opportunistic. Last year, a friend of mine who knows I love UN Freaks, he had a friend that was selling it, found out about it, and I couldn't resist making that purchase as well.
But this was very much I don't want to say of your own volition, but this was sort of an extension of your early curiosity with Ulysse Nardin. You weren't yet drawing from online influences.
No, exactly. That was the second I saw that watch. In fact, I even have an old magazine advertisement framed on my wall. That was my goal. So I had career goals, obviously I had personal goals. That was my watch goal. And that was almost a signpost of reaching where I wanted to in my career and the ability to be able to purchase that. And it brings me so much joy. I get stuck staring at that balance wheel for minutes at a time. And as I said, to this day, it's still my favorite watch.
What I love about it is that this is pretty much as exotic as watches got in the 2000s. But both of these watches show a lot of evidence of being carefully but frequently worn.
Oh yes, yeah.
This is like encountering a Lamborghini that's got like real miles on it, and you're happy to see it.
Yeah, so I keep most of my watches in a safety deposit box, but I rotate them all. There's no watches that I don't wear. For me, watches are there to be worn, they're to be enjoyed. I don't buy them for investment purposes, so wearing them and not being afraid to wear them. Look, if I accidentally damage it, then that's life. Hopefully not too badly, but...
I know that feeling. Like, at some point you gotta let your hair down and just enjoy them.
Exactly.
They're watches, you know?
Exactly.
And because you do have other watches, and I know the scope of your collection is far beyond what we have here, how do you decide when to sell or when to trade one out and trade one in? Like, do you have a rotational philosophy or know when you've fallen out of love?
So I know some people who are watching this will laugh at this, particularly in the horology watch chat I'm in. I started a 1 in, 1 out rule last year, and the joke is that it became a 5 in, 1 out rule. So I try and get rid of watches, but the bottom line is I buy them all for a reason. So usually I do have some sort of an emotional attachment to them, and I find it very hard to let them go. I'm a little bit of a hoarder in general, and when it comes to collecting things. So while I try to sell some, I'm not very successful at it.
Oh no, I totally respect that. I'm a very sentimental person myself, and I wish I could say that I had the watches I've sold, because years later, I miss them.
Yeah.
And I have those regrets. And I guess if you hang on to your watches, sometimes we have this passion to buy, but we also have like a passion to sell. And when that moment passes, a lot of times we've got regret. Do you have regret for ever having sold a watch or bought a watch? So buyer's remorse or seller's remorse?
That's a great question. So in terms of buyer's remorse, there's a few, but it's kind of blurred. So as I mentioned, I wish I'd got that with the Roman numeral dial instead, but clearly not that much of a buyer's remorse because I still have it and I still wear it a lot. The Panerai that I mentioned earlier, a little bit of buyer's remorse there, but although I got the one with the cutout dial, I still wear the other one. It's a great beach watch. So in terms of seller's remorse, I don't think so. There was a Zenith I sold once that I still think about a little bit, but it was a Primero, but no, not really. It's more, each one has a special place in my heart. Sounds a bit cheesy, but it's true. And certainly there isn't a single watch on this table that I would want to sell.
Well, that's excellent. And the fun thing about this table is, even though it's a peek into your broader collection, there are themes emerging. Grand Seiko is a theme. Christopher Ward is a theme. The watch you're wearing on your wrist actually fits the theme in a broad sense, because this is where community comes into the picture. Talk a little bit about like our horology WhatsApp group and how it steered you towards some of these choices that you made.
So my nephew runs a watch magazine in the UK called Oracle Time, and he was part of a horological WhatsApp chat, and he asked if I wanted to be added. I said yes, got into the chat. It's a fantastic community in there. The nice thing about it is it really does stick to watches. It doesn't sort of veer off on tangents. And this is really when I began to discover the likes of Christopher Ward, Grand Seiko. They hadn't really been on my radar before then. UN certainly was, obviously the APs, Pateks, etc. But I'd say that Christopher Ward and Grand Seiko, they both came out of that chat, as did Moser. Certainly some big fans in the chat of Moser. Give a shout out to Tim there. Yeah.
No, that's definitely cool, because I feel like the particular group we've got is like the unofficial Chris Ward fan club.
It does feel like that at times.
You've got a couple on order.
Yep.
I'll let you broach that news when the time comes. I'm not going to steal your thunder. But let's talk a little bit about the C1 Moonphase and also the C63 Tradetime, because this feels a little bit like, some well-known Moonphase watches, but you're talking an aventurine dial in an affordable watch.
Yeah.
And then right here, we've got what's effectively, I would almost say like a send-up of the old Girard-Perregaux WWTC Financial. So let's start with crypto.
Yes. So I work in markets, so a watch that has I don't work in equity markets, but that has the equity market times on it, I thought was quite fun. And what really made me laugh about it is the fact that it has crypto all around the outside because it's a 24-hour market. And it just made me laugh when I saw it. And it brings me a bit of joy, and it's a reflection of my career. So I really loved it when I first saw that come out, and I said, you know what, I've got to grab that one.
Do you have a little bit of sentimentality because they are a UK company?
Yeah, that adds to it. I must admit, I'd never really dived deeply into UK watch manufacturers. Certainly something that's come onto my radar more recently, I would say. A lot of people in that chat were at the British Watchmakers event recently. There's been a lot of photos of British watch brands, so I think that's one of the rabbit holes I'm going to go down next. And of course, we were discussing some of those brands earlier.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, here I am representing, wearing my Garrick right there, bringing back British watchmaking. But yeah, the WWTC Financial from Girard-Perregaux would have little arcs representing the times that the major markets were open around the world and when their trading hours overlapped. This just has a full 360 degrees crypto 24/7, which as of the late winter of 2024 is now cool again.
Yes, yeah.
This one's perhaps a little bit more timeless. Talk about the process, the thought process behind this, because this is not really a watch you buy for the time.
No, I've always been a fan of Moonphases. I'd never actually seen an Aventurine dial in the flesh until not long before I bought that, and it's beautiful. And the thing is with this particular watch, that moon, it really is very 3D. And I think this is something that Christopher Ward do fantastically well. They show that you can get beautiful made watches, beautiful looking watches, and they don't have to break the bank. And I think that this is a real standout in terms of that looks like a very expensive watch. And there are plenty of watches that have a similar vibe to them that are very expensive. And yet that is pretty much an entry-level price watch.
Oh, without a doubt. I look at this and I sort of think Arnold and Son Perpetual Moon, and then I realize what that costs and what this costs, and I can definitely see the argument for it. Now, a little bit higher up, I guess, the food chain price-wise, but very distinct as a brand. Just like Christopher Ward, I think Grand Seiko watches are unmistakable for anything else. So let's talk a little bit about the Shosho and also the US SBGA 491, because these watches have fun dials and fun stories.
Yeah, again, so when it comes to Grand Seiko, it wasn't a watch I was that familiar with. I'd heard about it, but I didn't really dive down that rabbit hole until a few people in the chat started posting some of their Grand Seikos, and the first thing that strikes you is the dial. All Grand Seiko dials are beautiful. I am yet to see one that doesn't leave an impression. And for me, this was an absolute standout. I was tempted by the Snowflake. I wanted a GMT. The only thing that disappointed me about that was I really wanted to get a spring drive, which I think is one of the most fantastic developments in watchmaking. And then when I saw this very recently, actually at 1916 Company down in Philadelphia, I instantly saw it and I said, you know what, that's a pretty dial. It looks almost like there's a gold flake to that green. And I'm not sure if there actually is, but when it catches the light sometimes, it tricks me that there is at the very least. But also seeing that little gold area there, that's quite unusual for Grand Seiko to use a different color for that patch. And with the gold hands as well, that sweep, I think it's stunning.
Really cool stuff and very different watches. I mean, both of them have a lot of charisma on the dial. Of course, right here with the 249, we've got a little bit more of a classical, historically inspired case. And not to say this one isn't classically or historically inspired, but the 44GS is a 60s shape that's a lot more forward-looking, angular, hard, masculine. It's more techno-industrial. It's the kind of thing where you look at it, it's like, this is almost like a cut gem that happens to be made out of metal.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to getting it on a strap though. I haven't seen that one on a strap yet. I've ordered one recently. I'm interested to see what that looks like. Usually I prefer straps over bracelets. That's not a hard and fast rule, but usually I am more of a leather strap guy.
Yeah, this is a really cool watch on a lot of levels because the effective use of two-tone is all on the dial. This is an all-steel watch, but two-tone, even if you're not a total fan of it, when it's contained within the dial, it's got a different character.
Yeah. And the gold against the green background looks fantastic.
Yeah, so this was part of a trio of Japanese katana-inspired limited editions for the U.S. market. A really nice piece, SBJ 491 right there. And you got spring drive. And talk a little bit about like what that means to you, because I think people misunderstand it. They hear spring drive and they say, well, isn't every mechanical watch driven by a spring?
Yes. So I don't have a problem with quartz watches, but for me, as soon as you add a battery to it, it changes. I like the fact that watches are mechanical and that they don't require electricity essentially to work. Now, obviously with a spring drive, you essentially have a kind of quasi quartz watch. So there's no battery, but there is still that quartz element. And I think that that's really interesting. But for me, the beauty of it is the sweep, because it is completely smooth. I don't know if there's any other watches that have a sweep that is that smooth. Perhaps you can enlighten me, but certainly it has to be one of the smoothest.
No, I mean, there are some very high frequency watches that can look that smooth, but this is actually seamless. There's no start, there's no stop, there's no tick, there's no tock. It is exactly what it appears to be. Now, you started with Ulysse Nardin fairly early in your collecting journey. As you know, we're kind of talking about the influence that our horology groups had on you and that group of collectors, Christopher Ward, Grand Seiko, but you did come back to UN, and there is sort of like a budding movement towards UN in that group.
Yes.
Is that what influenced you to go after the GMT Perpetual?
I've been one of the people trying to create that movement in the group, just because I have been a UN fan for so long, and it's a brand that's very dear to my heart. Now, of course, it's been through many different stages, and I'm personally of the belief that the future is very bright for the brand. So I was fortunate enough to be down in the 1916 offices with some people of that group a couple of weeks ago, and we got to see a whole manner of very beautiful watches, including one that might be my next Grail watch. Then this came along. It has the same sort of heft as the Freak. I don't own a perpetual calendar, or didn't own a perpetual calendar. It was the 28th of February in a leap year, which I can't deny did play a role there. And it really jumped out at me. And I found myself looking at the whole range of watches, and we had so many there, FP Journes, absolute stunning, very expensive watches. And I kept coming back and putting this one on my wrist. And yeah, I ended up diving head first. I promised myself I wasn't going to buy a watch on that trip, but I ended up coming back with that. And you know what? The timing couldn't have been better, because it might sound a little sad, but watching that flip from 29 to 1, it's just a real indication of how impressive movements can be. I mean, when you think about what's actually involved in that, it's unbelievable. It really is.
Without a doubt, and this has been one of the best perpetuals of all time. Came out in '96 on the Perpetual Ludwig, but you can adjust it forward and backward, no damage. Gives you the year, gives you the decade, a full perpetual calendar indication, and there's a lot of themes that are kind of running recurrences in your collecting journey. You've got a watch that's big, it's got a meatiness, it's got a weight in precious metal, you've got a GMT function, you've got an unusual, extravagant, expressive dial, and you know, just as you made the dual time watch part of your collecting journey for its functionality, you seem to have fallen in love with the perpetual calendar. Is that the start of a new trend?
Yes, maybe, though it's a pretty expensive trend, so we'll see. But that for me was the perfect perpetual calendar to get, just because I really do love that so much. And if you look at the black of the dial, it's a very deep black. I think it's a lacquer, but it almost looks like onyx. And it kind of encapsulated everything that I wanted in a perpetual calendar. I understand that there'd be a lot of people that I don't think would like that watch, that might think it's a little bit too busy, a little bit too much going on, but I really love it. And I think it fits with the theme of the Freaks. Obviously a very different watch, but it's still that size, that heft, and that UN ingenuity.
And you know, you sort of come full circle here, because now you do have the Roman numerals on the dial.
Yes, exactly. I'm a big fan of Roman numerals on dials in general, actually. Yeah.
It's a very classical look, and you know, to me, it's almost like a link to the origins of mechanical timekeeping with clocks. It's almost a little bit like that sort of formality on your wrist.
Yes.
And a really cool concave crystal on this one.
Very unusual, yeah. I can't think of any of them. There probably are, but I don't think I've ever seen another watch with that.
I've seen some funky things done with crystals, but like truly bowl-shaped concave, no, this stands alone.
Do you have any idea why?
I would say first, because of the way that the light plays across it, it does weird things at odd angles, and I guess that's recapturing a little bit of the curiosity of the old acrylics and plexiglasses. But also because it does cool things with the dished chaptering that bears the 24-hour subdial, and I suspect that it might make it easier to refer to it from angles.
Right.
Since
Yep,
it does
that
run
makes
around the
sense.
periphery, but then it's also just cool.
Yeah.
There's that too.
Yeah, and I love the fact that it does have that 24-hour indicator. I use a 24-hour clock for digital clocks. I'm a big fan. In fact, the Patek Philippe, the Calatrava with the 24 hours on, certainly got my eye on that. I don't know if I'll be able to get that anytime soon, but that's a watch I've been looking at recently.
The 5224, it's on your radar.
Yes, it is. It is.
But you know, you also have independents on your radar. Now, granted, Chris Ward and Ulysse Nardin, they qualify as independent, but I think as we use the term indies, we mean smaller brands.
Yeah.
And I guess the Horology Group also sort of helped move you in that direction because you're wearing a Moser.
Yes. So a lot of fans of Moser in that chat. And at first I sort of looked at it and I was thinking, well, it seems pretty plain, but then I saw it in the flesh. And it's very difficult to describe how much these dials pop and how they suck the eyes in until you see one in the flesh. And for me, it's the movement is very well made. You get a microscope, you start looking at the back, and you can see the quality there. And I also like what Moser stand for. And I think there's a few brands that are trying to do this at the moment, but really connect with their collectors, be accessible, be able to have conversations with them. And they brought out a lot of whimsical pieces, which, as you could tell from the Alain Silberstein and perhaps even the Swatch, I like whimsical pieces, and they really do knock it out the park when it comes to some of those.
Without a doubt, we were talking about the famous Swiss Icons watch where maybe they knocked it a little bit too far out of the park. But you know what? Sometimes it's good not to take watches too seriously, and that's proof that their heart's in the right place. Now, another thing I see that's common to Ulysse Nardin and Moser is, you know, they're independently owned, I would say mid-sized independents, because, you know, they're making thousands, not 10,000, but also not 1,000 a year. So they're sort of in the middle range. Mathieu Haverland, the general manager of Ulysse Nardin, he spent a whole day with us.
Yes.
He sat for an interview that's going to be on this channel. Really accessible, seems to understand that you can't be in an ivory tower when you're running a brand. You got to connect with people.
Exactly, and his visions for the company I think are fantastic, so I certainly think it's in good hands, which as a UN fan makes me very happy indeed.
Yeah, and myself as well, because I'm rooting for these guys, talking about things like fair pricing, buying up inventory, taking control of the pre-owned market, bringing in collectors from the start of the design phase of a new product. The other thing is you get the same with Moser at Ward Milan. He's come, he sat for an interview, he's been in the studio, and he's been around the States and Europe and Asia talking to collectors. It's just great to have that accessibility.
Exactly, and I feel like with Moser, there's a little bit of a club aspect to it. If you know, you know. If you see someone with a Moser on, you know that they know about their watches.
And I just got a message from him on my Facebook group today. He's like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm so late in responding to this. It was like a week later. I'm like, dude, you're the CEO of a watch brand. You don't even need to answer me, but thank you.
Yeah, and I think the thing with Moser is you're always excited to see what they come up with next. I mean, an Apple Watch. Who would have thought we'd see a mechanical watch that looks like an Apple Watch?
No, but it's good because it's almost like an acid test of people's sense of humor. If they're like, oh, they're copying the Apple Watch. Okay, you don't get it.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't get it.
Exactly, but it's supposed to be fun, right? It's supposed to be fun.
And Alain Silberstein understood that well.
Yes, indeed.
So now looking forward, where do you see yourself going with the collection? I know you talked a little bit about the Patek 5224, but that's not really an indie direction. I know you're curious post Moser and UN and Chris Ward looking deeper into that space.
Well, I think one of the watches I do have my eye on that I actually saw in the flesh for the first time a few weeks ago is the MB&F Moser collaboration. Very unusual watch, very heavy dome dial. That is something I've got my eye on, but going back to the topic of grail watches or however you want to put it, I've decided that I want to leave that until I have another milestone in my life that justifies me buying that. And for me, again, it's about something that measures the passage of time, also marking these static moments in time. So I keep looking at it. It's definitely on my radar, and at some point I hope to purchase it. But that's going to be a little bit further down the line. In the meantime, we spoke about Christopher Ward. Jazz, who runs the horological chat we were talking about, has a couple of custom pieces coming out from Christopher Ward that I've been on the list for. So I'm looking forward to those, a bel canto in a custom color and a variation of the 12 in a custom color. So very much looking forward to those. But beyond that, It really is, I think, the micro brand rabbit hole that I'm going to dive down, and I'm certainly going to be looking to you for a bit of advice on that.
And I will be as fulsome as I can. But you know, we all have our own tastes, and I like to put a lot of stuff out there and give people options, and then they pick the one they like, which is why I never slam a watch. Because a watch I don't personally like might be something that is literally the dream watch of another collector. So I try to keep my mind open and understand that there's a diversity of opinion out there. It's like you find on online communities. Now, since granted, our horology group's just like a few dozen guys. What kind of communities do you recommend online for people who are maybe like where we were 20 years ago, just starting our journeys as collectors?
Yeah, I mean, look, YouTube's always a great place to start, right? The quality varies a lot. Obviously, we have some outstanding sources. So first thing would be go look at your stuff without a shadow of a doubt. But it's easy to learn now. And I think in the past, that was a lot more difficult. You really had to find your own way. I mean, to be blunt, I've only been in the group for less than a year. And prior to that, my watch collecting was very much a sort of personal thing. I used to talk to the brick wall about the watches that I owned essentially, or bore my fiance to death about them. But it's really nice when you're able to join a group and you're able to talk about something that you're so passionate about and find other people that are very passionate about it. And then you realize there's a whole social network out there, various events to attend. And I think that that's a great way to start. Everyone's very welcoming for sure. And as you pointed out, everyone has their own taste. I'm well aware that my taste sometimes can be quite, how shall I put this? I think some people would say bad. I'd like to call it unique. But certainly I think, you know, if you love something, then you should stand by that. Just because other people don't like it doesn't matter. And I think that's very important for watches. Yes, there's trends, and we're all guilty of jumping on trends sometimes, but it should really be about what you like.
And your collection really is kind of emblematic on that, because there is one very niche Patek Philippe. You've got a very niche Royal Oak and two-tone. You've really forged your own path, and I think that's a great consequence of having a strong sense of your own tastes and not letting other people second guess that.
Yeah, exactly. Now, there's nothing wrong with learning about watches from other people, but don't buy a watch because you think it's the right watch to buy or because you think other people will like it. That is a recipe for disappointment. It really has to be something that you feel good about. And there's been plenty of watches that I've thought that I loved. I've seen it online, even some that I've perhaps purchased, I've put it on, and it's a great watch, but it doesn't work. I don't feel a connection to it. And I know that sounds, again, a little cheesy, but I find that every watch that I am passionate about, that I love, I look at it and I get joy. There's a little moment of joy every time I look at it. And for certain watches like the Freak, I try and look at it quickly and then I end up sitting there staring at it for about 30 seconds. And a lot of people must wonder what I'm doing because I'm just sitting there staring at my watch. But when it really does give you that emotional impact, that's when you know you found a keeper.
Christian, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Real pleasure, thank you.